Sometimes we get deep dive requests, and they're really chilling. And this one you sent in is definitely no exception. This is about the Ashley Young case. So imagine you finally have that child you always dreamed of after, being told you couldn't conceive a miracle baby. And then years later, the unthinkable happens. She's brutally murdered, and to this day, parts of her are still missing.
It's just awful, a parent's worst nightmare. And it's a case that raises so many questions, so we're going to take a close look at all the sources you provided, including the audio from the True Crime podcast and some news interviews, just to try and make sense of it all.
Yeah, it's a tough one for sure. So let's set the stage a little bit. Ashley Young was a 31-year-old woman, full of life, and she goes missing after a night out with a guy named Jared Chance. What starts as a missing persons case quickly spirals into a horrifying discovery in Jared's basement.
And then it just gets even more complicated from there. We'll be exploring the events leading up to Ashley's disappearance, the investigation itself, the trial, and all those lingering questions that continue to haunt Ashley's family, especially her mother, Christine.
Right. Let's start with Ashley. What kind of person was she? The podcast paints a picture of someone deeply compassionate, devoted to her work at a group home for adults with special needs, and incredibly close to her mom.
Yeah, and there's this recurring theme in the sources about Ashley seeing the good in everyone, even those who might not deserve it. This tendency to focus on the positive seems to be a core part of who she was.
Okay. The sources also point to this really strong bond between Ashley and her mother. You get the sense that they weren't just mother and daughter, but best friends.
Absolutely. You can just hear the pain and desperation in Christine's voice during the interviews. It's clear that Ashley's disappearance and murder completely shattered her world.
Yeah. Which makes what happened all the more tragic. But before we get into the details of the crime itself, let's talk about Jared Chance, the guy Ashley was out with that night. He had a past, didn't he?
A troubled past is putting it mildly. The sources you provided detail a history of violence and some really erratic behavior. We're talking bullying, fights, even an incident where he assaulted his own brother with a blowtorch.
A blowtorch. Whoa, that's intense. And it wasn't just a one-time thing either, right?
Right. There were multiple arrests, overdoses, and instances where his own family called the police on him. The podcast mentions that Jared's behavior was so concerning that they were actually afraid of him.
Wow. So knowing all this, it begs the question, why would Ashley, someone so kind and trusting, be friends with someone like Jared?
Yeah, it really is a puzzle. The podcast mentions that they originally met through work, and that Ashley seemed to believe she could help him turn his life around. But, years before her disappearance, Jared actually betrayed her trust in a pretty significant way.
Oh, right. He broke into her apartment and stole a bunch of her things and sold them to fuel his drug and alcohol use. You'd think that would be the end of their friendship.
You would, wouldn't you? But for some reason, after 5 years of no contact, they reconnected. Maybe Ashley held on to hope that Jared could change, or maybe her compassionate nature made her overlook the very real danger he presented.
It's a reminder that sometimes even the kindest hearts can be vulnerable to manipulation. So let's fast forward to that fateful night. What do we know about what happened before Ashley vanished?
Well, they started the evening at Jared's apartment with his downstairs neighbor, Mario. Then they went to a hookah lounge, followed by a bar called Mulligan's Pub.
And there's security footage from the bar that shows them leaving together, right?
Exactly. That footage is the last confirmed sighting of Ashley alive. After leaving Mulligan's, they stopped at a liquor store on the way back to Jared's apartment, and that's where the trail goes cold.
Until Christine steps in. When Ashley doesn't show up to sign her new lease, remember they were incredibly close and planned to move in together, Christine takes matters into her own hands and becomes her own detective.
She's relentless, calling bars, tracking down security footage, posting on social media. Christine just refuses to let her daughter fade into the background. And this is where the story takes a truly heartbreaking turn.
Yeah, it's Christine's determination that leads us to the most horrifying part of this story. Remember Mario, the downstairs neighbor?
Yeah.
He was driven by this, foul smell to investigate Jared's basement.
And what he finds is just devastating.
It's just awful. A blood-soaked tarp covering Ashley's torso.
Worm.
No legs, no head.
Just pure horror.
It's just awful. This gruesome discovery, it just shifts the whole investigation into overdrive, but it also raises a whole new set of questions. What happened to the rest of Ashley's remains? And what really went on in those final hours? The sources you sent paint a pretty disturbing picture of the evidence tray. It wasn't just the basement. They found traces of Ashley in Jared's apartment, his parents' house, even a dumpster at a local party store.
It seems like Jared was just desperately trying to cover his tracks. In his apartment, investigators found saw blades, bloodstained clothing, shower curtain rings, and even some of Ashley's belongings mixed with cleaning supplies.
It sounds like a scene straight out of a horror movie.
It really does. And it gets even more unsettling when you consider that Jared called his parents, Barbara and James, to help him move things out of the apartment. They drove all the way from their home in Holland, loaded boxes and bags into their car, and even stopped at Ashley's car to grab more stuff.
So Jared's parents were involved. To what extent? Were they aware of what had happened?
That's a question that haunted the investigation and then the subsequent trial. Did they knowingly help Jared cover up a murder? Or were they manipulated by their son, unaware of the true horror of what they were actually transporting?
It's hard to imagine not being suspicious, especially when you consider the bonfire. Jared and his parents burned a lot of stuff that night. Doesn't that scream trying to get rid of evidence?
It certainly raises red flags. And according to the podcast, Jared's brother, Conrad, later testified that Jared confessed to killing Ashley and dismembering her body right before they all went to the police station.
Wait, so they went to the police station knowing full well what had happened. That's mind-boggling.
And even more puzzling is why they waited a full day before going. And why did James, a former police officer himself, insist on a lawyer for Jared, even though he wasn't technically under arrest at that point?
There are so many layers to this case. It's like peeling back an onion, and each layer is more disturbing than the last.
And while all this is unfolding at the police station, back at Jared's apartment, officers discovered that horrific scene in the basement. They get a search warrant and start finding even more evidence. It becomes a race against time.
And then there's that dumpster at the party store. The podcast mentioned security footage showing Jared buying cleaning supplies and throwing a bag away.
Inside that bag, they found even more of Ashley's belongings. Prescription bottles, her ID, clothing stained with blood. It's a chilling reminder of the lengths Jared went to conceal his crime.
So we have a mountain of evidence, a concession from Jared's own brother, and the horrifying discovery of Ashley's remains. It seems like an open and shut case, but there's a catch, isn't there?
A big one. They never found Ashley's head, hands, or feet.
Oh, wow.
This lack of a complete body, it made it impossible for the medical examiner to determine a definitive cause of death.
So how do you even prosecute a murder case without a complete body and without knowing exactly how the victim died? It seems like it would be incredibly difficult to prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt.
You're right. It was a challenging case for the prosecution, but they were determined to get justice for Ashley. They built their case using the evidence they did have. The bloodstains, the dismemberment, witness testimony about Jared's history with guns, and of course his brother's account of that chilling confession.
So they theorized that he either bludgeoned her or shot her in the head, since they couldn't rule out a gunshot wound without the skull. What about Jared's defense team? What was their strategy?
The podcast mentioned that they tried to float the idea of an accidental death. Maybe Ashley accidentally shot herself, overdosed, or had some kind of freak accident, and Jared, in a panic, tried to cover it up.
But that doesn't explain the dismemberment. That seems like a pretty extreme reaction to an accidental death.
Exactly. The prosecution argued that the dismemberment showed premeditation, like a deliberate attempt to hide the crime and make it harder to identify Ashley. The jury ultimately agreed, finding Jared guilty on all charges: second-degree murder, mutilation of a body, concealing a death, and tampering with evidence.
Wow. And what about the sentence? What kind of punishment did he receive for such a horrific crime?
The judge, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation and the immense suffering Ashley's family endured, sentenced Jared to 100 to 200 years in prison.
So he'll basically die behind bars.
Yeah.
For all intents and purposes.
But even with that sentence, there's this lingering sense of injustice because Ashley's remains are still out there. Her family can't properly lay her to rest without knowing what happened to the rest of her body.
The podcast actually played a clip of Christine's victim impact statement during the sentencing. And it was absolutely heartbreaking. She talked about hugging a box, pretending it was Ashley, because so much of her was still missing.
That's just gut-wrenching. And what about Jared's parents? Were they ever held accountable for their role in all of this?
That's where the case gets even more complicated. The prosecution argued that they were more than just unwitting accomplices.
Right.
That they knew what was in those boxes and actively helped Jared move evidence.
Uh-huh.
They even suggested that they may have assisted in the dismemberment, pointing to a missing shower curtain from their house. And remember, James, the father, had a background in law enforcement. Did he use his knowledge to try and shield his son from the full force of the law?
It's certainly possible. In the end, Barbara pled no contest to perjury and being an accessory after the fact. She received a relatively light sentence, 45 days in jail, followed by a year of house arrest.
Wait, only 5 days for potentially helping to cover up a murder.
Yeah. Ashley's family was outraged. They felt like the justice system had failed them. James also received a light sentence, 30 days for being an accessory after the fact, and a year of house arrest.
It's hard to understand how they could get off so lightly, especially considering the possibility that they might know where the rest of Ashley's body is and have chosen to remain silent.
To this day, neither Jared nor his parents have revealed any information about the location of Ashley's remains. There was one interview with Jared where he seemed like he wanted to say something, but then stopped himself. It's almost as if he's protecting his parents, even from prison.
So we're left with this incredibly sad and frustrating situation. A young woman's life is brutally cut short, her family is left to grieve without closure, and so many questions remain unanswered. Did Jared's parents actively participate in the cover-up? What was Jared's true motive? And where are the rest of Ashley's remains?
This deep dive has taken us through some incredibly dark territory, but it also highlights the complexities of the justice system and the devastating ripple effects of violence. It's a stark reminder that even when a perpetrator is behind bars, the search for truth and for peace can continue for years, even decades.
What stands out to you as the listener as we reach the end of this deep dive? For me, it's the strength and resilience of Christine Young. She refused to give up on her daughter, becoming her voice when she could no longer speak for herself. It's a powerful testament to the enduring power of a mother's love.
And it leaves us with some important questions to ponder. What if we all channeled a bit of Christine's unwavering spirit? What if we were all more attuned to the needs of others, more persistent in seeking justice, more vocal in speaking out against violence?
Maybe then, stories like Ashley's wouldn't just haunt us. They'd inspire us to create a world where compassion and justice truly prevail.
If you'd like to learn more about this case or contribute to the reward fund for information about Ashley's remains, you can visit the website listed in the show notes.
And if you'd like to delve deeper into more fascinating and thought-provoking stories, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for joining us on this difficult but important deep dive.